There is an increase in DDoS attacks during this pandemic.
Hey Ganesh, tell us some more about these increased DDoS attacks you've been catching.
Thanks, George. There's a study, basically, a report put by SecureList about increased DDoS attacks, especially during the pandemic. They did some comparative analysis and contrasting, comparing with the last few quarters as well as from the last year at the same time of the year, and they came up with some statistics. I'm going to pinpoint a few interesting facts and see why there's increase in actually during this pandemic time. The first thing right off the bat, what they said is basically when they compared with the second quarter of last year and with the second quarter of this year, they attributed there's about 220% increase in the DDoS attacks happened during this quarter time. Again, if you compare this the same quarter 2 of 2020 with the quarter 1 of 2020, it's about 30% increase in actually DDoS attacks. Overall, if you take it, I think the takeaway is there's certainly increase in the DDoS attacks happening this year compared to the last year's quarters. And the most important facts, I think I feel, are the identification of 2 DDoS amplification attacks. One is basically based on DNS, which they called it NXNS attack, which is basically a non-existent name server attack. In this case, I think a rogue person basically sets up a rogue DNS server within his realm, but he sends a legitimate request to root servers, pointing out to some of the servers which is under his control. What happens is by sending this one, when the root server's response is, there's an amplification factor of about 1620 times. That means for 1 byte sent, there's about 1620 times amplification of traffic. I think that kind of actually results in a huge amplification factor. And the second one they identified during this quarter is, I mean, it's not by the SecureList, but in the DDoS attacks, these are the new tactics they incorporated in addition to various SYN flags, UDP flags, all the other flags, actually they do it. The second one is called range amp, which is related to HTTP. I think it's the way how the HTTP range request implementation is being done. It seems to be prevalent only in the content distribution networks. There are 2 ways actually this can be carried out. I think there's 2 methods this can be done. But the key factor is, I think when this specific range AMP attack actually has been implemented, there's about 700 to 43,000 times amplification based on, I think, how the CDN network is configured. But luckily for both of them, updates are available. I think somebody has to basically check what version of they have and get the appropriate patches to basically minimize the risk in this case. And one important factor is actually, I think the number of attacks happening per day in each day actually kind of peaked at 300 and sometime in April, which is not quite a norm. I think that's a huge increase if you take out any day. And one interesting trend is attacks from the botnet seems to be always high on Wednesdays or Thursdays and kind of slowing down or peaking down on Saturdays. I think more like, I think seems like, following the hump day kind of thing. And based on their analysis, one interesting fact is almost about 95% of the attacks are SYN flag, which is basically just sending the regular SYN flag and overwhelming the targets and the victims basically not serving the purpose what they intend to be serviced. What are the prime targets? The prime targets are educational institutes and governments are the primary targets with the mix of other industries, but these are the 2 primary targets. And that seems to be changed, I think, at the start of June. I guess educational institutions have been off the targets list. I believe that's due to the fact in U.S., especially in the U.S. region, that's the time of the summer vacation for the schools. probably that's one of the reasons they have been targeted during since June, and hopefully I think it remains that way. And one important factor seems to be when they compare to Windows as well as Linux-based botnets, most of the majority seems to be by the IoT/Linux-based botnets, which was about 94% of the attacks. And one important factor, I think, based on the experience, if we compare to the previous years, any of the DDoS reports, most of the reports, they tend to say typically April to June is basically, I think, a slow period in the DDoS attack vector. But this year, it seems to be, the trend seems to be reversed. And that's one of the reasons they're kind of attributing, because that's a fact. I think that is during the time everybody in the world started working from remotely. I think when people are working from remotely, there could be somewhat lacks in security. I think there will be the prime targets. Prime targets in the sense they will be the easiest targets to attack. And also nowadays at home, everybody has multiple devices, right? If one device is compromised, they may get multiple devices which they can incorporate into the botnet. So those are the interesting trends. I think because of the reasons, they're saying actually the DDoS attacks, in fact, increased during the second quarter of 2020.
Typically, we have like a high increase like during the winter holidays, right? Or something like that. It seems to be. So now we're seeing it peaking earlier. Is that going to continue, or do you think that will continue through the winter holidays, or maybe even go higher?
Personally, I hope everything comes down, but I'm afraid to say probably we'll see more and more, especially now education institutes are opening up, and they may be targeted again. That will definitely increase the attack surface a little bit, as well as you alluded, John, I think with the holiday season around the corner, again, we will see lots of DDoS attacks, especially towards the gaming industries.
Yeah.
So I may see it may be inching towards upwards rather than coming downwards.
Okay.
Yeah, you mentioned, Ganesh, too, that they were one of the popular days were Wednesdays, you said, right? When they would start the attacks?
Yeah, the peak of the attacks were either Wednesdays or Thursdays.
Okay.
I guess, it's basically, I think, falls to midday for based on the geographic location, right? I think it may be.
Yeah, they know they'll catch people whether they're later in the week or earlier. Okay. I was just thinking maybe that's trying to line up with people's patch schedules, because most people follow Microsoft's Patch Tuesday, so maybe they're like, okay, once everybody patches on Tuesday, if we start on Wednesday, a lot of companies don't want to break their schedules, right? So they'll have up until the following patch, week 2 patch, even though this isn't necessarily Microsoft patch is not necessarily going to fix the infected hosts, but I don't know if maybe that's something that maybe they're using as a guide.
I'm not sure, but that's an interesting observation. But for example, as you alluded, if you take the Microsoft patches, it happens once a month, right?
Right.
It's not going to happen every Wednesday or Thursday. Probably there might be something. Maybe there's more bang for the buck if they choose to attack on Wednesdays and Thursdays rather than on rest of the days. But for the comparative purposes, definitely it's higher. But if you look at in their posting in SecureList, they have some beautiful graphs explaining things around. You can see the trend. They're not much difference. There's a significantly higher, but there's not much difference when compared to other days also.
So anything else from the story, Ganesh, about what might be coming our way, in the future?
I think the interesting thing is I kind of worried about the two DDoS attack vectors, NX attack, because of the amplification and also the range amp. I think that's more worrisome because of the amplification factor. But luckily, there are some sort of patches available, and they did some study on various CDN networks, and they have various actually levels of amplification. I think the key factor is if are exploited, the amplification is so huge, it's really difficult to defend against them. I mean, we are talking about almost like a 40,000 times amplification in some cases within range. So yeah, I think volumetrically they're growing bigger and bigger. That's a little worrisome. Luckily, I think we have patches. I think whoever is actually having some sort of a defense mechanism, they should look into actually tackling these two new DDoS attack vectors in addition to what we already know.